IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of All Things Policy, and I am your host Apurva Kumar. Today we are going to talk about the legal ambiguities around the freedom of speech and expression in India and its consequences. But before that, let's begin with a paradox. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the world's oldest democracy, America, legally transformed freedom of speech and expression into an absolute constitutional right. On the other hand, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the world's largest democracy, India, allowed the right to freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a) to be reasonably restricted in the interest of 8 other democratic goals of the Indian state. As this amendment mandated an act of balancing, a distinct space was created for the judiciary or the legislature to produce an unambiguous stream of interpretations and clarifications to prune out the vagueness associated with such terminologies found in Article 19(2) as reasonable, in the interest of, public order, decency, morality, incitement, etc. While the legislature has over the years receded from its interpretive role to acknowledge the judiciary as the Constitution's final interpreter, the latter has, on its part, produced a series of ambiguous judgments which have left the contours of Article 19(2) blurry and unpredictable. Therefore, even after 74 years of India's independence, it is difficult for an Indian citizen to predict with some certainty the set of words or combination of sentences which can be reasonably restricted under Article 19(2). What we explore in this podcast are the possible reasons for this ambiguity, the immediate effects of this ambiguity on the reach and scope of Article 19(1)(a), and some possible solutions to address these ambiguities through creative policy interventions. And to talk about these issues, I have a very special guest today, Ratika Gaur. Ratika is a political scientist who, since the past 6 years, has been keenly researching on freedom of speech and expression. She is an assistant professor at Miranda House, Delhi, and is also pursuing PGP at Takshashila institution. So welcome, Ratika.
Thank you so much, Apurva. Thanks for having me.
Ratika, before we delve deeper into the topic and especially the legal ambiguities on the freedom of speech and expression which you have talked about, help us understand this term chilling effects.
Okay, so I will break it down for you very simply. First, I will explain chilling effect in general, and then I will explain what is chilling effect for free speech particularly. Okay, so every citizen in India is supposed to follow the rule of law. Now, to facilitate citizens in obeying the rule of law, the law itself should possess 3 characteristics. There should be a clarity of what the law demands. This clarity in turn comes when there is precision in law, that is, accurate words are used in framing the law. And finally, clarity also results when the law remains consistent in what it means and demands. In other words, when there is an absence of any or all of these characteristics in law, that is clarity, precision, and consistency, it results in a legal ambiguity or a legal confusion. Because citizens are suddenly unaware of what is or is not qualified as breaking the rule of law when they exercise their legal rights. So the vague, overbroad laws generate in them a fear of legal repercussion, and this fear is exactly what we call chilling effect. So the next time when you face a sense of fear when you are about to express your opinion on a public platform because you don't know whom you may offend, focus on that fear, because that is chilling effect and is most commonly consequenting into self-censorship and a fear of exercising one's legal rights. So therefore, you can also call chilling effect as a behavioral symptom of the absence of a clear rule of law in a society. Now, talking in terms of the context of free speech, the fundamental right of freedom of speech and expression is supposed to empower an individual with 5 different capabilities. Okay. These 5 capabilities are: 1, whether to speak; 2, when to speak; 3, what to speak; 4, how to speak; and 5, whom to speak it to. So, whether, when, what, how, whom. These 5 capabilities together constitute what a fundamental right to free speech is supposed to be. If you, as a citizen, are feeling fearful in exercising any or all of these 5 capabilities, then that may be a sign of chilling effect.
Great, thanks, Ratika. So you spoke about precision, clarity of law, and consistency.
Yeah.
Is this what leads to this ambiguity?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So, if any one of them are missing in terms of the fact that the law is not very clear in its wordings or in its framing, it uses an ambiguous term like decency, or it is using an ambiguous term like morality, and is unclear about whether this morality term is supposed to mean public morality or it is supposed to mean constitutional morality, then under those circumstances, it leaves a lot of gap for interpretation. Now, this gap is most often filled with many a times contradictory judgments by the courts. Many a time it is filled by contradictory laws and enactments and acts by the parliament, and together they lead to a lot of vagueness both for the executive as well as for the citizen. While the executive uses it many a times to their advantage because it leaves a lot of scope for misuse of the legal provisions, for the citizens, it leads to a sense of self censorship where they just don't know exactly what will be counted as offending a religious group or what may be counted as offending decency and morality. I'll give you a very interesting example here, Apurva. So, Tripurdaman Singh, right, in his book, he writes that the First Amendment to the Constitution, as you mentioned, it limits freedom of speech and expression, right? And it was introduced at the time when the government was trying to implement a lot of social change through the directive principles, but citizens were exercising their fundamental rights in order to point out the loopholes or gaps in the government's implementation. This was in the 1950s. So the First Amendment was enacted for the very same purpose. One of the problems which the government of the time had was with the fact that many citizens were calling out for war with Pakistan at the point of time. So this was very problematic. They were calling out names to other neighboring countries out loud in public on public forums in magazines, etc. So keeping that consideration in mind, decency and morality as a provision was introduced in Article 19.2. That is the section of the Constitution which limits freedom of speech and expression. But very interestingly, in today's times, decency and morality is used in order to assess censorship or free speech for cinema, for cultural speeches, as well as for cinematographic expressions. So while provision was constituted for the purpose of preventing wordings or for the purpose of preventing phrasings which would insult or incite such speeches or such actions from the government that might lead to war at a very sensitive point in time during independence, the scope of the provision was so vague that it has now transformed into being used more often and almost exclusively now for restricting expression in the genre of entertainment. So that you can see is one of the very clear indications of how a lack of clarity in law or a lack of precision in the wordings of the law, because many of the times this wording was challenged or a lot of cases were brought in front of the court saying that the morality in question was public morality. And so even section 370 or LGBTQ as an issue and their right to expression in public was often considered as a case under public morality, whereas later on it was interpreted by the court that this morality is supposed to mean constitutional morality, not public morality. But not just in case of the LGBTQ, there are many other examples in which you will find that still there is a lot of gap, a lot of space, a lot of vagueness in the ways that the legal terms are formulated, which often lead to a lot of opportunity cost for the citizens because they have to always weigh in their consequences. And when they have no sense of control or certainty of the consequences over their expression, they usually choose not to express as much in the public space, which is exactly why, according to a lot of survey reports globally as well as nationally, India is not performing very well in terms of the demand for free speech. We often think that the problem lies on the supply side. And while that is true, there is a lack of political will many a times in the governments because free speech demands accountability. So it has lesser incentive for the government. But the truth is that because of legal ambiguity, there arises self censorship and therefore even lesser demand for free speech in the Indian society.
Right. Thanks. Very interesting, Ratika, and thanks for reminding us of the fascinating book 16 Stormy Days. It's
Yeah,
there in my reading list for a very long time. So thanks. I should sort of I should get a hang of it.
it's really good.
But you spoke about judgments and the ambiguities that have come through those judgments.
Yep.
Could you talk about one or two such judgments that have come off late that has kind of perpetuated or strengthened these ambiguities?
Sure. So, first of all, just to clarify, I'll reiterate what you spoke just in the introduction. In India, the problem of legal ambiguity, which causes chilling effect, is a legacy of two primary institutions, right? First of all, either the law framed and enacted by the parliament are worded ambiguously, or second of all, the judiciary interprets the law ambiguously by producing very different, often contradictory meanings of controversial laws. And this is happening because, very interestingly, there are very different methods of interpretation used by the judiciary. Six of them were often identified. And on the basis of the kind of methods that the judiciary would use to interpret various cases, I think it was Mr. Chandrachud who had differentiated between three distinct phases of the judicial rulings. And he says that currently the judiciary is functioning under what he calls panchayati eclecticism. Right. In this, what happens is small benches of the courts are instituted. They have a sense of their own reputation. The judiciary is aware about how it is often considered as the harbinger of social change in the Indian society. And therefore, they have a sense of importance in a way that makes them very aware of the consequences of the judgment. So most of the times, as Mr. Chandrachud had also noted in his work, what happens is the court often determines the social outcome of the case beforehand and then takes the step backward in terms of interpreting the law in question or the section or the wordings uh, of the phrasings or whatever in question, right? So what happens under these circumstances is that the courts often end up producing contradictory judgments. They are not reading the judgments delivered by others. They often face the pressure or the self perception of producing a landmark judgment. They need to prove their mark on their own, and therefore often the third point that I was mentioning in terms of, or the second point that I was mentioning in terms of the clarity of the law and the consistency of law, that often tends to miss because of the various judicial interpretations which are often produced in the contrary sense. So take for example very recently, say the Disha Ravi case. Okay, there the question of sedition, and it is very fascinating because sedition is not even mentioned anywhere in the constitution, right? You don't find the word sedition in the constitution. Everybody knows that it is a legacy of the colonial era, and therefore many advocate that it should have died with the colonial times itself. But nevertheless, what happened was that the only wording mentioned in the Constitution in Article 19.2 is public order, right? So the 8 restrictions I'll just enumerate for you are security of the state, overthrow of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, contempt of court, defamation, incitement to an offense. Right. So under Ramesh Thapar ruling, what the court had done was it had cumulatively assembled security of the state, overthrow of state, friendly relations, incitement to offense. All of them were clubbed together under public order. And through various court judgments, what was done was sedition as a ruling was read into public order, and therefore it was assumed that the wordings of sedition, this is interesting, section 124A, which is basically considered to be the section which allows the government to charge a speech for sedition. It prevents speech if it causes disaffection towards the state. Now, what is the meaning of disaffection here? Is it disloyalty? Is it overthrow of the state? Is it threatening the security of the state? If it is public order, then one, it comes to the question of public order, which again the court has often interpreted in contrary terms. There are two very distinct, very parallel, very opposite interpretations of public order that you will find in the legal proceedings. And on that account, not only has sedition been brought into the constitution under article 19(2) by the judiciary, but also there is confusion still about what is disaffection, and you just absolutely don't know as to which Twitter of yours, which Facebook post of yours, which WhatsApp of yours even might allow the government to take legal actions against you, and then it is totally upon you to deal with that legal case, to deal with the public prosecution, which often comes with such cases. And that has very much resulted in the fact that the government is, in fact, many governments, since pretty much before the present or the contemporary times, have been misusing sedition. And even the government's own data reveals that between 2014 to 2019, there is a spike of over 300 arrests, a 165% rise in sedition cases in India. And from these 300 arrests, only 6 have been convicted. But just imagine the cost that would have been paid by the other citizens and their relatives and the people they were in touch with, and that ripple effect that would have created from those 300 arrests. So this becomes a humongous responsibility, right? Then again, I'd like to talk about these sections is section 153A or section 295A, which are meant to curb speech which outrages religious feelings, right, or disturbs harmony between various groups. Now, what do you even mean by outraging religious feelings? In Shreya Singhal case, which was, by the way, the case that really drew a direct parallel between vague overbroad laws and the chilling effect it causes on individuals and their right to free speech. So the Shreya Singhal case, it used a distinction which was developed earlier in Aru Bhuyan case. And in that, the court draws a distinction between discussion, advocacy, and incitement. And that was one of the few clear ways in which the court had iterated of how just outrageous religious feelings or simply an advocacy cannot disturb the harmony between various groups or cannot outrage religious feelings. But the very fact that these wordings continue to exist in legal terms gives the executive enough scope for their misuse, in the sense that even if section 66A of the IT Act was repealed, declared void by the judiciary, the government still, it has been noted by the Penn report that the government is still misusing those laws, is still registering complaints against using the section 66A, precisely because there is just no parity between the workings of the judiciary, the workings of the executive. There is just no clarity of law. People themselves remain unaware, and you can see this translating into practice of how Justicia report very recently in 2021, I think it is released, and it notes that while in theory or in principle, yes, Indians support free speech, in 89% Indians are supporting free speech. When it comes to the question of criticizing the government, this number shoots down to just 67%, right? And again, on the question of whether you are supportive of speech that may be construed as offending religious minorities or your own religious beliefs or other minorities, this support further declines down to just 26%, because people are just not aware of what exactly does or does not count as offending religious minorities, what kind of gap or breathing space, a term again used by the courts, what kind of a breathing space do people have in terms of expressing their discontent with minorities, their behaviors, or certain religious groups, and then that amounting to sudden outraging religious feelings or disturbing harmony. Just another point, just an example. I know you asked for only two, but I'd go ahead and give you one more. Then there's contempt of court, and the court itself uses contempt of court, or interprets this provision of Article 19.2 as scandalizing the court. Now, what is supposed to mean as scandalizing the court? And mind you, the court itself it sometimes gives very progressive rulings, but when it comes to its own reputation in the eyes of the individual, it says that very minor instances can also amount to scandalizing the court or lowering their reputation in people's eyes. And therefore, more than 1 lakh cases are pending with the courts when it comes to the provision of contempt of court itself. So the judiciary itself is no far behind. In fact, is itself producing a lot of contradictory rulings, where in so for example, again, in terms of defamation, criminal defamation, that is, on the one hand, the judiciary has produced a very speech protective ruling, right? In terms of decency and morality, or the rights of filmmakers, it says that even truth of a statement cannot amount to being used as restricting somebody's speech. And on the other hand, in defamation, it suddenly reduces the freedom of, say, press or other individuals who are writing about or talking about other institutions or individuals of repute, to the fact that, okay, only those documents can be accessed which are in the public domain. Your truth, the burden of proving the truth is falling on the defendant. And that itself is leading to a lot of anxiety amongst individuals, right? If you go back to the graph of VDEM, you would see that as the government censorship is increasing, the freedom of the liberty of press is also declining in a certain extent, that the press is exercising self-censorship, precisely because it has been so unsure about where it would be nabbed by the government, that really, I mean, there really needs to be a lot of clarity. The Penn report, it notes 12 vague, dangerously ambiguous provisions which India has, and you would see most of those provisions contain the same wordings: sedition, religious offense, defamation, contempt of court, IT Act. In fact, the IT Act again has a central monitoring surveillance system which allows the government to monitor. It gives government the permission to monitor digital communication, but without issuing any orders to the service providers, either in written form or otherwise, right? So this fear of surveillance is again another consequence of chilling effect that really needs to be dealt with, and we have to focus on this, because you see, it correctly just translates into practice instantly, and you find that despite India being the largest market for Facebook, on social media platforms, only 35% social media users share and receive information. Only 25% know and share current affairs of the country. And merely 18% share views on current affairs. Right? And again, I'm citing this from the LA report, Limited Access Restricted Speech. I'm citing that. It was in 2018, I think it was released. And you can find all that data here. Very concerning.
Right, fascinating, Ratika. Thanks for the detailed explanation. You have spoken about specific cases. I'm glad that you have raised that point, because I will come to that. But right now, I will take a short break, and we will discuss this further after this short break.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Priya Mirza, host of our new podcast, The Longest Constitution, talks to Cyrus about her show and her podcasting experience. The importance of investing in a good night's sleep is highlighted by founder and CEO of Sleepy Cat, Kabir Siddique, on Advertising is Dead with Varun. On The Wire Talks, Siddharth talks about the horrendous capture of Kabul by the Taliban with the author and journalist Taran Khan. Co-founders of the Goa Rainbow Trust, Francis and Chris Fernandez, joined Farhad and Sunetra on GBCD. Witness the epic battles between detergent brands HUL and Nirma, as narrated by Anupam and Ambi on The Last Brand Standing. Do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you enjoyed this show or any of our shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word about a podcast. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Ciet Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Intuit India. We really do appreciate the support. You are what makes this possible.
Welcome back, and we are talking to Ratika on the chilling effects of legal ambiguities around freedom of speech and expression. So, Ratika, you have spoken about the legal ambiguities, and just before the break, you were talking about some specific cases, specific examples about these ambiguities and the effects that it can cause. What are the implications of these ambiguities on our society and also on our politics by and large? And how has it played over the past few years?
Okay, well, there are many and quite diverse implications, I'd say. The culture of fear and self censorship, which emerges from the chilling effect of legal ambiguity, is seen to be directly proportional to people's low faith in democracy and the rise of populist politics or majoritarianism. Because the lesser the people are given space to voice their dissent, to say this is where we face problems and this is how we need solutions from the government and this is how quickly we need those solutions, the people have a lot of resentment. There is a lesser letting off of steam, and therefore people feel, how is this democracy serving us? If democracy makes people sovereign, then how is this democracy serving us when we don't have enough rights to exercise, right? Plus, if on topics which are controversial, and as I had noted before as well, on many controversial issues, India don't support a lot of free speech expression, right? So, if on controversial topics we're not having enough discussions in the public forum, in the public space, not many opinions get discussed and then pruned. This results in people supporting a lot of majoritarian political views, populist views, which are more orthodox, which are more dogmatic than well discussed. Because even after discussion, you may stick to your belief, but at least you would know that there are these counters which you will always be posed with. And you will also have the satisfaction of being given the choice to convince others of your belief, right? But if not, then that results to a lot of inward resentment. There is no letting off of steam. And as already mentioned, then that might lead to an appeal of majoritarian politics. There was also a survey done by, I think, Ravdil. This happened in 2018, where he said that in Sweden, people are more susceptible to becoming majoritarian because the government does not allow for an open discussion on the immigration policy for minority groups. So it also shows in that context how free speech can help. And in a very directly related point here, I'd also like to mention that increasing the chilling effect has also been correlated with increasing potential of terror threats to a country or a government. This is because with consistent self censorship, again, people are unable to vent their dissatisfaction and demands. And again, there is no letting off of steam. And if you reverse this, the studies also show that a 1 point positive change in freedom of discussion can reduce the risk of potential threat attacks by nearly 50%. So you see what we are letting go here. I mean, if we really, and every country should aspire for national safety, but if that is the way, one method is to also strengthen the demands and to strengthen the supply of free speech in the Indian society. But besides all this, there is also important to look at the social cost, right? Because the dilemma of democracy is such that it always wants to embrace a more active public while ensuring the equality of political voice at the same time. But while participation opportunities have broadened in India, as with many other places, there exists a sizable socio-economic participation gap across all types of political actions. And you can find the signs of this participatory gap boldly reflected in the Justiciary report as well as India's Spence analysis of protests in India. I'll come to this also. But look at it even from a common sense point of view. No two individuals with different economic and social positions can afford to exercise and defend their rights in equal measure. Even the Penn report also affirms that chilling effect in India affects the marginalized sections of the society the most. And lastly, I'd also want to talk about the economic cost of the chilling effect on the government. I mean, we think that, okay, this is only going to affect the people, but that is not so. The government equally has a lot to lose, and I can show you how. Because, okay, let's focus on the farmers' agitation. The Economic Times, I think, I'm quoting from the Economic Times. It says that the current farmers' agitation has cost the government over 70,000 crore of economic loss. Right. And it's not just the current farmers' agitation. The previous Bharat Bandh on labor reforms cost taxpayers nearly 18,000 crores, according to India Spec. And similarly, the riots in Karnataka over Kaveri Row, it resulted in a loss of 22,000 to 25,000 crores. If you take all these statistics together and then look at what India Spend has to say, it reveals that India has an average of around 200 protests per day. Now, one may think that, okay, now this is a good thing, right? But no, if
Yeah,
you
because
think this is,
because India is a land of million trees, so it should be
yeah,
good. Yeah.
if you think of this as a good thing, then I have two things for you to note. Of course, it is a good thing that people get their voice to protest, but just note, protests are often resorted to by citizens when the government turns a deaf ear to other forms of everyday dissent, right? And two, according to India Spend, it is mostly the political parties, not common people, which lead 50% of these protests. So, are high number of protests really a sign of citizen empowerment? It's worth wondering. Of course, they are. But to what degree are we considering these protests as a sign of empowerment? Whether they are socially viable, whether they're economically viable for the government to have so many protests because people are not given enough spaces to vent, because people are not allowed enough vent, and they think that individually there is not enough impact they can make. It's only in groups that they come together where they can hide from legal repercussions but still try and make an impact. Because remember, law punishes the individual, not the group. So it is always an incentive if the government is not listening to individuals personally or on their individual level. It is always an incentive for them to come together forcefully so that they can prevent themselves personally from legal repercussions, but can also then hope to have some kind of an impact on the government. And also, again, I go back to the LAR report. It points out that since the past few many years, the most often resorted to techniques by the government. It also discusses the kind of techniques the government uses to respond to the protests or various agitations by the people. The most often resorted to techniques by the government have been either ignoring or crowd dispersal. Just imagine. So if this is clearly not a good sign for us to think about, and the government needs to think that it cannot always force citizens to come out and protest, because the government too will incur huge costs, huge legal repercussions. And so it's much better to increase other ways, channels, voices of protest, of voicing one's demands, of suggestions. And the government should be more open on a rather daily basis, I feel.
Right, right. So I think lots of interesting points, and you just spoke about the deepening of democracy and the participation gap that has also come, as a byproduct, or that has happened in tandem. I think that demands another sort of a podcast
Absolutely.
episode, and we can have a separate conversation on that very fascinating topic. But whatever you have said is quite scary as a citizen, and it's quite alarming also. So and we have just come to an end of this conversation. Could you just suggest some of the solutions that can address this, these ambiguities and the chilling effects? Are there any policy solutions to this?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first step to achieve legal clarity with respect to right to freedom of speech and expression is for authorities to ask themselves a three-part question. And I'm moving from a more theoretical level, and then I'll go to more policy solutions. But I feel like this kind of a conceptual clarity is important not just for the authorities but also for the individuals themselves on their interpersonal relations. Because see, right to freedom of speech and expression can be interpreted in two ways. One, it leads to a lot of personal freedom, a freedom of expression for one's own self. And another, as a right to information, where you have access to the information which can allow you to hold government responsible and can also help you make rational decisions in your own life or in the society political space, right? India has set up a number of frameworks in order to provide a right to information. If you interpret freedom of speech and expression as a right to having information, a right to be informed before you make a rational choice. So in that sense, India has provided an RTI. India has provided, a central information commission, state information commissions, etc. But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, when it comes to individuals exercising expression for personal autonomy, for personal freedom, for empowerment, for personal progress, that is where it's very, very dubious. And here I think, yeah, are where my policy solutions are going to come. So again, I go back to what I was saying before. I think the authorities first should get a legal clarity about what right to freedom of speech and expression is. And I think for this they should ask themselves a three-part question. Here I'm quoting from Stanley Fish, by the way. The first question is, what does the speech aim to do? The second is, do we want it to be done? And the third is more to be gained or lost by moving to curtail the speech? And let me tell you, the test for all of these questions is but one, and that is social purpose. This test has been devised not just by India's national movement legacy, not just by India's philosophical heritage, where always speech was considered to be as a method for the marginalized sections to raise their voice, to gain more equality, and therefore always had a social purpose. But in general, if you think about it, right, speech has value only if it has a purpose, right? So it's important to understand that Article 1918 does not protect any and every form of expression. It is meant to give a special coating of protection to only such expressions which can contribute to the social progress in India by making the society more inclusive and plural, diverse, right? More tolerant. So think of Article 19(1)(a) as protecting, and all at all costs, it's protecting the high value expressions, whereas Article 19(2) is meant to weed out the low value speeches which have the potential to do more harm than good in India's social progress. So maybe I can think of examples like an expression which reduces your moral worth to your caste, to your geography, or your religion. We often use such slangs which recognize people by their geographical belonging or by their caste, and if those expressions clearly they have a lower value, and therefore you can weed out those expressions through Article 19(2). But there are so many expressions which hold such strong value for a society, because even personal progress is a social progress, right? And that is where Article 19(1)(a) should be strongly protected, both by the government, by the judiciary, by the parliament, as well as the citizens in their interpersonal relationship, right? Once this sort of clarity is achieved in the minds of law framing and executing authorities, the next step should be to dig up the various tests devised by the court. So the court, in all its rulings, in the legacy that it has created of its rulings, has created a number of tests, such as spark in the powder keg. This is for public order, and that it says that, okay, in order to assess the consequence of whether or not a speech is going to be tried under public order, can be restricted under public order or sedition, apply the spark in the powder keg. Is there a proximity of the speech to any kind of a harm consequence caused in the society immediately? So if I say give a speech and say after just a few hours there is a rioting, you can associate my speech with incitement to offense. But if not, then you cannot try it under harming public order or under threatening the security of the state or overthrow of the state. Again, the court, as I mentioned, also in a number of cases devised a difference between advocacy and incitement as another test. In terms of decency and morality, over the years, the court has produced the test of contemporary community standard and an average person's rationality. And it says that looking at the average person's rationality and the contemporary community standards, do you think that this speech is to be restricted? More often than not, the court has been more open to accepting speeches of diversity, right? So I feel like the next step after getting your own mental clarity about how you should deal with free speech, the next step should be to dig up all these tests by the court and then assess if the wordings of the laws made in the parliament or already in the or already in the constitution or the IPC, etc., are in sync with these underlying objectives of these legal tests, right? Then the government should also come up with a kind of a national or state surveys which can measure the direct correlation between chilling effect of legal ambiguity and free speech in India. Because currently there are no such national measures. It was rather surprising for me during the course of my research that despite having, there are more than 1,000 court cases which mention the effects of chilling effect, right, on free speech. And despite that, there is no clear survey in India which can directly assess or measure this chilling effect and legal ambiguity on free speech. So this direct correlation, I mean, if I ask you, okay, do you self-censor yourself? You do you self-censorship yourself? You might give an answer, yeah, maybe, okay. But if I ask you pointedly, and that is what they teach us in research as well, that the way the survey questions are framed are how the respondents are going to give their answers. So if I ask you specifically that because you do not know what counts as government criticism, are you avoiding government criticism? Your answer might change. It is a possibility. And you don't even know if chilling effect is in fact a degree of problem, or how big is it a problem, until we measure it. So I think a national measure is very important. We can use this national measure maybe to develop a fearless freedom index kind of sorts, which can measure the amount of fear which ambiguous legal provisions create in citizens when they exercise their legal right? At a more basic level, I think the academic curriculum must be more robust. Currently, the political science courses in major universities do not offer to teach fundamental rights, fundamental duties as a separate subdiscipline. These topics merely constitute a chapter in school and undergraduate courses. So I wonder how would budding citizens find their empowerment if we are not specifically focusing or offering to teach them the meanings, the interpretations, the juxtapositions between fundamental rights, fundamental duties, what they have been interpreted as over the years, which laws affect them, which don't. So I think we can focus, or the government can look at an option of creating a separate subdiscipline, or the universities can do that at their own individual levels, or something of that sort. I think a few more, if I have to think about, the civil society can strike to come up with their individual indexes and surveys on the same issues to tally government reports. They can also strive to create a legal clarity for citizens on their rights. I think if I have to sum up lastly, and I think I should now, the only way to increase the supply of free speech in any society is to increase its demand. And you only demand free speech if you are unafraid to exercise your legal right. This fearlessness must be the hallmark of India's democratic empowerment, if I may say.
It's really fascinating, because I think for the first time I am hearing someone talking about the demand and supply of free speech, Ratika. Very fascinating. And as you were talking, I was just making copious notes of whatever you were saying, because I'm sure we can have a multiple conversation on this theme. But really fascinating conversation, Ratika, and I'm glad that you did this conversation with us. So thank you so much, Ratika, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Apurva. I look forward to many more such conversations, because speaking always brings more clarity. So I think in this sense we can have a better discussion maybe next time on some other issue, taking more specifically one of the aspects of what we've discussed in general today, right?
Absolutely. And I would agree that I would sort of confess that in the next episode, I would agree to disagree with some of your
100%. Look forward.
Great. Thank you, Ratika. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Apurva. See you.
And thank you, listeners, for listening to this episode. We will be back with another interesting episode with another interesting topic. Goodbye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST. or our website takshashila.org.in.
आजकल लोग पॉजिटिव शब्द से ही डरते हैं, पर यकीन मानो कोविड के आगे भी दुनिया है जहां पॉजिटिव और सही चीजें जरूरी है। और हमारे देश में जहां-जहां ऐसे काम होते हैं, स्माइल इंडिया मौजूद है। यही समाचार तो ढूंढ कर लाती हूँ मैं, शिफा माइत्रा, आपके लिए हर गुरुवार। स्माइल इंडिया आप सुन सकते हो हिंदी और अंग्रेजी में IVM के ऐप पे, वेबसाइट पे या जहां कहीं से भी आप पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो।
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood, get accustomed to womanhood, enjoy the experience of sisterhood,
might get to wifehood
or not, choose motherhood
or not. You'll learn to define your personhood,
earn a livelihood,
change the neighborhood,
and get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Ritasha,
And me, Ayushi,
on a journey from station starting point
to station, what now?
next station, Pudin station, and hopefully Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.